Happy Sunday, everybody. Hope you're doing well. I thought today we would talk about some books. I am often asked for recommended reading lists, what I read, what I suggest other people read. Thought it would be fun to share a few books that I've really enjoyed. The title for today's musing, of course, comes from section 88 of the Doctrine and Covenants, where it says that as all have not faith, seek ye diligently and teach one another words of wisdom. Yea, seek ye out of the best books words of wisdom. Seek learning even by study and also by faith. So obviously I would include, something like the Book of Mormon or Scripture in the best books, but there's a number of other interesting books as well. I've chosen 10 to share with you today. By no means is this a comprehensive list. There are many others that I wanted to put on here. These aren't even maybe necessarily my top 10. They're just 10 that I wanted to share. Maybe some of them will probably be familiar to you, and some of them will be new. So your Amazon wish list may grow by a little bit if you haven't read any of these. Which one to start with? I'm not going to go in chronological order. Okay, I'll start with Joseph Smith. This is going to show up backwards for those watching the video. Joseph Smith, Rough Stone Rolling. I remember when I read this a number of years ago, 18 years, something like that. You may recall this history that there was a bit of controversy surrounding the publication of the book. Deseret Book wasn't carrying it. Many members saw it as more of an anti-book. They felt that Richard Bushman was being critical of the prophet and that it was not a flattering, faith-promoting biography. I had a different experience myself when reading it. Yes, Bushman goes into all of the foibles and follies of Joseph and his family, talks about the treasure seeking and some of these weird societal or sociological trends that were going on at the time. But what I really enjoyed about the book was the fact that it highlighted how someone with a bunch of warts and bumps and bruises in their life and imperfections could be called and molded by God to do such spectacular things in the true sense of the word spectacular. And so I always appreciated the book because I didn't and don't have any problem with Joseph being very imperfect and having, a checkered past, if you even want to call it that, or just kind of an odd, some family traditions and things. Like none of that really mattered to me because I was able to come away from reading this book feeling like if God was able to take someone like that as raw material and turn him into what Joseph became, that's faith promoting for me to realize that with all my imperfections and all my foibles and problems and everything, that God can, use me as an instrument and do great things as well. With each of these books, I'm just going to share a little excerpt. This one is very underlined. I was flipping through it earlier and trying to decide what should I share. This kind of popped out. It's actually from the preface of the book. So again, I'm reading from Rough Stone Rolling, Joseph Smith, Rough Stone Rolling, A Cultural Biography of Mormonism's Founder. All right, it says, Joseph Smith is interesting for what he was as well as for what he did. He was the closest America has come to producing a biblical-style prophet, one who spoke for God with the authority of Moses or Isaiah. He was not an eloquent preacher. He's not known to have preached a single sermon before organizing the church in 1830, but he spoke in God's voice in revelations he compiled and published. A revelation typically began with the words like, "Hearken, O ye people, which profess my name, saith the Lord your God." Many thought him presumptuous, if not blasphemous, and he made no effort to prove them wrong. He did not defend his revelations or give reasons for belief. He dictated the words and let people decide. Everything he taught and most of what he did originated in these revelations. The question of this book is how such a man came to be in the age of railroads and the penny press. What was the logic of his visionary life? Joseph Smith did not offer himself as an exemplar of virtue. He told his followers not to expect perfection. Smith called himself a rough stone, thinking of his own impetuosity and lack of polish. He was sensitive to insults and could not stand to be crossed. Twice he was brought to trial before one of his own church councils for scolding offenders too severely. He so dominated the rooms he entered that some thought him arrogant. But it was his iron will that brought the church, the cities, and the temple into existence. Okay, another little final portion. Richard Bushman says, I've also undertaken to explore a side of Joseph Smith not adequately examined in other biographies, his religious thought. There are good reasons for this neglect. His thought is not easily encapsulated or analyzed. His teachings came primarily through his revelations, which, like other forms of scripture, are epigrammatic and oracular. In other words, just spoken and specific to circumstances. He never presented his ideas systematically in clear, logical order. They came in flashes and bursts. Nor did he engage in formal debate. His most powerful thoughts were assertions delivered as if from heaven. Assembling a coherent picture out of many bits and pieces leaves room for misinterpretations and forced logic. Even his loyal followers disagree about the implications of his teachings. So, that's rough stone rolling. I should also note that I just started reading, I got in the mail this week, Bushman's new book all about the golden plates. So similar approach to rough stone rolling, where it's kind of a cultural history, understanding the dynamics of the time and the context in which all of this happened. Bushman's new book takes that treatment to the gold plates specifically to talk about them. Okay, so that's book number one. Book number two. Let's go with The Crucible of Doubt. This is by Terrell and Fiona Gibbons. Subtitle is Reflections on the Quest for Faith. Not a very long book. Terrell Gibbons in particular, and to the extent I've read anything from his wife Fiona, I've not read anything that she independently has written, but she co-authored this book with her husband. But Terrell Gibbons is a deep thinker. He's, I think, cut from a similar cloth as someone like Richard Bushman. Very intentional with their membership in the faith, their belief in church doctrine, but having kind of a scholarly, what would you even call it? I won't say critical, but independent type of kind of perspective, rather than maybe like a church historian that just takes the faith promoting line and they're what's called an apologist. You're just a defender of the faith, and that's the point that you take. So this is a good book. Again, it's not a long one. It's really talking about the topic of doubt and questioning, written kind of in response to the time that we're in. Many people perceive that, with the internet and, the church's history being more transparent, all these people are having doubts and, questions and so forth. And so that's the context in which this particular book emerges. So, little portion from this book. Airbrushing our leaders, past or present, is both a wrenching of the scriptural record and a form of idolatry. It generates an inaccurate paradigm that creates false expectations and disappointment. God specifically said that he called weak vessels so we wouldn't place our faith in their strength or power, but in God's. The prophetic mantle represents priesthood keys, not a level of holiness or infallibility. That is why our scripturally mandated duty to the prophets and apostles is not to idolize them, but to uphold them and sustain them by the prayer of faith. I like that because a lot of the individuals with whom I've spoken who have had doubts and faith crises, it's because of this faulty perception about church leaders, this cultural tradition, if you want to call it that, a tradition of our fathers, where we kind of revere and reverence and almost semi-deify, church leaders, and we cling on their words as if, they are a prophet always and forever with everything that they speak. And then something happens, or they hear something, or, whatever, and the two worlds collide, and all of a sudden these people just cannot compute, right? I most recently, to any significant degree, I saw this during COVID, when the first presidency came out with a letter and said that the jab was safe and effective, and it is neither of those things. And, urging people to get it and urging them to wear masks. And you had apostles saying that wearing a mask is a sign of love for others, and all this stuff that I consider, frankly, incorrect and nonsense. And many members of the church, especially the conservative, socially conservative, theologically conservative, run-of-the-mill kind of standard true-believing Mormon, many of those people had strong concerns with, health freedom and the jab and the mask and all these things. And so all of a sudden their two worlds collided and they had to reconcile, wait a minute, am I wrong on the health stuff, or might it be that, a leader of the church could be, cowering to fear or deferring to governments with their approach to this, or, just frankly wrong about the issue. So I had a number of conversations with folks who were really struggling with that. And so anyways, this book, The Crucible of Doubt, is a very interesting one. So if you or anyone you know is grappling with, church history or doubts or questions or whatever, I think a book like this would be good. I think doubting is fine. I think questioning is fine. I do a lot of questions on these musings. I don't think we should just go up to the podium and say, I know this and I know that, and all these things that ultimately many times we don't know. We believe, we choose to have faith despite ignorance or doubt or questions. That to me is more powerful, to say, despite all these things, I choose this, and here's why I choose this, right? Instead, I think a lot of our testimonies have the tendency of becoming a bit formulaic by just claiming we know all these things, but we're not admitting and being vulnerable to share the doubts and the questions, but then the intentionality of working through those and still choosing the quote-unquote covenant path. So good book, and that's number 2. Let's do an oldie but a goodie, Jesus the Christ. This is my well-worn, totally discolored, it's normally this red, but it's been sitting in the sun with the spine facing out, so now it's turquoise. Talmage wrote this. This was a lengthy project that he did, writing often up in the temple, an exhaustive review of everything the scriptures say about Jesus. He wrote it, I think, in the 1910s, 1915. Became kind of the authoritative text about Jesus's life and ministry. My copy here is very underlined. If you have never read this, I highly recommend it, especially while we're in New Testament mode this year. It just shares the story really well in a lot of detail. And it was a really enjoyable read. Fun little fact, on my mission, I was nuts. I don't know why I did this, but I created kind of an index where I cataloged, because in a book like this, you'll have footnotes, right? Hey, this part of the narrative pertains to this scripture or whatever. So every time a scripture was referenced, I would go out and write what page number it was referenced on. So then I could do the reverse. If I'm studying, let's say it was Romans chapter 8, and we're, reading about God's love, I could then go to my little index thing, and then I could find the pages in here where he talked about it. I haven't used that since my mission. I did that in the MTC. Anyways, so good book, very worth reading. Here's a little portion. His message delivered, the angel Gabriel departed, leaving the chosen virgin of Nazareth to ponder over her wondrous experience. Mary's promised son was to be the only begotten of the Father in the flesh, so it had been both positively and abundantly predicted. True, the event was unprecedented. True also, it has never been paralleled. But that the virgin birth would be unique was as truly essential to the fulfillment of prophecy as that it should occur at all. That child, to be born of Mary, was begotten of Elohim, the eternal Father, not in violation of natural law, but in accordance with a higher manifestation thereof. And the offspring from that association of supreme sanctity, celestial sireship, and pure though mortal maternity, was of right to be called the Son of the Highest. In his nature would be combined the powers of godhood with the capacity and possibilities of mortality, and this through the ordinary operation of the fundamental law of heredity, declared of God, demonstrated by science, and admitted by philosophy, that living beings shall propagate after their kind. The child Jesus was to inherit the physical, mental, and spiritual traits, tendencies, and powers that characterized his parents, one immortal and glorified, God, the other human, woman. I like how Talmage writes, and this is a century ago, back when they would use multiple syllables in words, and things weren't so dumbed down like today. So he definitely writes with the style at the time in a very kind of formalistic prose that I think is enjoyable to read, and just tries to elevate your intellect a bit more than just dumbing it down and being a fluffy book that you find at somewhere like Deseret Book, speaking to people today at the current level that they're at. Okay, let's do Visions of Glory. This was really interesting. It kind of spread like wildfire a few years back. I think like 10 years ago is when this came out. Yeah, 2012. John Pontius is the author. He's written a number of other books. He's, I guess, not so much the author as the conduit, if you will. This book, Visions of Glory, is a claimed set of near-death experiences from an anonymous individual named Spencer in the book, who allegedly told John Pontius his story and his experiences and the visions that he had. I have read a number of other near-death experience books. I find them very intriguing. I don't necessarily believe they're all true. I don't necessarily believe that everything in this book is inherently true, but I find it fascinating, if nothing else, to kind of increase my own speculative dreaming and thinking about spiritual things and entertaining. Like I mentioned, I think a week or two ago on Amusing, that I really loved Chris Stewart's The Great and the Terrible series that I've got my son now reading. And I loved that series of books because it was helping, and it's all fiction, right? But it helped me to entertain possibilities and circumstances I hadn't really thought about before. And so similarly with this book, Visions of Glory, maybe the whole thing is made up. Maybe only parts of it are true and the rest was embellished. But I think it is very much worth the read, if for nothing else, like a fiction series like Great and the Terrible, to get your mind considering things like this. Because there have been near-death experiences, and there have been revelations and visitations and ministrations and all the things. So maybe this particular account has its, defects, but I enjoy reading these just to pull me in that direction and get me thinking about those things. So here's a brief portion from the book Visions of Glory, One Man's Astonishing Account of the Last Days. It says, I asked, so he's being visited by an angel. He says, I asked, does the earth have a tunnel of light? The scriptures inform us that the earth is an intelligent and living thing. He answered, the visitor, he answered, yes, God provided a similar means for the movement of the earth to where it now is. I then experienced, as if I were actually there, how the earth, quote unquote, fell from where it was created and moved to where it is positioned now. I had the impression that it took thousands of years for it to arrive. The image I saw appeared to me to be a folding of the universe. It looked like the universe was folded in on itself like a sheet of thick paper or fabric, so that where the earth was created and where it was to go were on top of one another. The earth was then moved from where it emerged and physically transitioned to its new position. This moving of the earth occurred during the entire creative process. By the time it arrived, it was prepared for mortal man. I also saw that when it is time for it to return to its original location, the universe will again fold, and which makes you think of, I think it's Isaiah talking about the heavens rolling up like a scroll, which kind of interesting. When it's time for it to return to its original location, the universe will again fold, and the earth will be moved back to its place of creation. The image I saw revealed that even though we perceive one plane of existence, there are an infinite number of planes stacked or layered in the same space. These planes are not truly universes because they are less about infinite stars and suns and worlds, as they are about God's organization and exaltation of all his creations and his assigning unchanging glory and laws to each plane. Human language does not give us adequate words to describe such things, nor does human intelligence give us the ability to understand such things unless our minds are open for a moment. While I was with the angel, I could understand all of this clearly. I believe I remember most of what I saw, yet now I have only a fragment of the understanding of what it meant or by what principle it occurred. So, fascinating. Again, could be total made up, but, consider it science fiction or theological, historical fiction, if nothing else. But it's a fun book to read and really contemplate. It's like reading some of the early revelations about apocalyptic things in the future and all these big upheavals and changes that we don't really talk about on any given Sunday. We don't really dwell on them. We don't really focus on them. We just, let's have faith and love and take the sacrament, and all those things are great and they're important, obviously. But we kind of push aside the grandiose and the spectacular and the things that are less relevant to our daily lives. And yet, if we believe that they are going to happen, it's still worth periodically entertaining these ideas, pondering them, learning various interpretations or claimed revelations and so forth. So, fun book. All right, let's do the teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith. This one was compiled by Joseph Fielding Smith and is really just a diverse collection of different teachings. I find this interesting in part because of the quote I read from Bushman, where he says that Joseph did not really expound on this concrete theology, from stem to stern, and as if he was writing this big book to succinctly summarize it all. Instead, it was these bursts of revelation, often in response to particular circumstances and questions in his mind, or events that were happening. And so all these revelations came and they were compiled, and that's how we got the Doctrine and Covenants, and which, by the way, I think I shared this months ago, but there's some books called Unpublished Revelations. I'm looking them up here, compiled by someone last name Collier, and those books include a number of revelations that didn't make the cut in the compilation for the Doctrine and Covenants. So those are fun books to read through. But this book, Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith, is basically a compendium of all those bursts of revelation, right? All the different topics that were produced. All right, so here's a quote. This is from Joseph Smith, one of his teachings on how salvation is acquired. He says, "All men know that they must die, and it's important that we should understand the reasons and causes of our exposure to the vicissitudes of life and of death, and the designs and purposes of God in our coming into the world, our sufferings here, and our departure hence. What is the object of our coming into existence, then dying and falling away, to be here no more? It is but reasonable to suppose that God would reveal something in reference to the matter, and it is a subject we ought to study more than any other. We ought to study it day and night, for the world is ignorant in reference to their true condition and relation. If we have any claim on our Heavenly Father for anything, it is for knowledge on this important subject. Could we read and comprehend all that has been written from the days of Adam on the relation of man to God and angels in a future state, we should know very little about it. Reading the experience of others or the revelation given to them can never give us a comprehensive view of our condition and true relation to God. Knowledge of these things can only be obtained by experience through the ordinances of God set forth for that purpose. Could you gaze into heaven 5 minutes, you would know more than you would by reading all that was ever written on the subject." Really fun book. I've got this one highlighted up the wazoo. It's just, while not this cohesive, flowing text of, something, you're just reading all these little quotes and chunks and things. But still, there's so much in here that we often don't talk about on Sunday and we don't really focus on. So it's good to get directly into the head of Joseph Smith and see all the things, or most of the things, that he was talking and teaching about. So, Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith. I will next go to a similar one, which is the Lectures on Faith. This is a short little pamphlet that you can get, and some of you may recall that the Lectures on Faith comes from the School of the Prophets, where Sidney Rigdon and Joseph kind of teamed up on producing these. To what degree, we don't know, if it was more Joseph or more Sidney, but Joseph clearly approved of them. They were taught in the School of Prophets, and they were combined with the revelations in what became the Book of Commandments, the Doctrine and Covenants. And the name Doctrine and Covenants is important because the revelations were the covenants, God's covenants with his people. And hey, here's, my relationship to you and what we're doing. The doctrine in the Doctrine and Covenants was this. It was the lectures on faith put next to the revelations, Doctrine and Covenants. Now the Doctrine and Covenants is really just the covenants because a number of years ago, decades ago, the lectures on faith were removed, in part because of some theological concerns in one or two of them that some of the church leaders had at the time, where Joseph's understanding had not fully developed in certain areas, or added revelation came later that superseded it, and so they didn't really like that it was still teaching this stuff. Okay, brief quote on this. This is a quote I've shared before. I'm sure you've heard it, but I find it powerful, and really it's like the framework of the overall lectures on faith. It says that 3 things are necessary for any rational and intelligent being to exercise the faith in God necessary for salvation. First, the idea that God exists. Second, a correct idea of his character and attributes. And third, a knowledge that the course of life one pursues is in accordance with his will. So, the lectures expound on that point, breaks them down into detail, and really enjoyable to read if you've never read them before or it's been a while. Doesn't take long, and it would be a good Sunday read. Next one, I could not find my copy of the book. I was looking everywhere. For those of you watching the video, I record this in my library, so these are mostly all my church books right there, and then these are historical books, and then I've got different areas of the room for other books. So I was looking all over this morning, and I must have loaned it to someone and never got back. I haven't looked at it in a couple of years, so someone has my book. But David O. McKay and the Rise of Modern Mormonism was a fascinating book to read because it peels back the mystery and intrigue that often surrounds leaders of the church, right? Their journals, their diaries, the meeting minutes, all these things are locked under key, in the First Presidency vault, and there's not a lot of transparency. Well, it was different with David O. McKay. When David O. McKay became president of the church, he had a secretary, as the general authorities do. Her name was Claire Middlemiss, and so she had been his secretary for, 20 some odd years or 30 some odd years, for a long time. And she had been with him throughout his whole apostleship. And so he goes up now into the First Presidency, and the tradition at the time, or the practice at the time, was that there was a dedicated, secretary or assistant for the First Presidency. So that as people would come and go, you had that assistant or secretary there. David O. McKay says, no, I'm bringing Claire Middlemiss with me. So he bucks the trend, the tradition, and keeps his longtime secretary with him to help him. Now, Claire, she would take copious notes of all the meetings, all the calls, all the things. And so she ended up with all this documentation, as was common at the time with secretarial work, to be able to document all these. Now, what's fascinating about this story is that Claire Middlemiss's documentation did not end up in the hands of the First Presidency vault. They ended up in her attic. She retained personal possession after the death of David O. McKay of all of these documents. I don't know if it was intentional. I don't know if they were copies made, somehow, because they didn't have Xerox machines at the time. But for whatever the genesis is of these documents, she had an attic full of them. So she passes away, and I believe it was her nephew was going through the estate and kind of taking care of all the affairs, and he finds these boxes of meeting minutes and notes and all these details about the inner workings of the upper echelons of the church. And so he reaches out to a guy who's a historian and says, hey, I've got access to these records. Do you want to team up on this book? And that's how we got this book, David O. McKay and the Rise of Modern Mormonism, as a result of direct access to documents that historians are otherwise denied. Right? If a historian today goes and says, hey, I'm doing a biography on President Hinckley, I want access to all the meeting minutes when he was in the First Presidency, they're not going to do that. Sometimes if you're like the Joseph Smith papers or one of these like church approved projects, you're going to get special access to the First Presidency vault and be able to selectively review some things. But this book had is the fruit of having direct access to these documents. And so what you find in the book is a number of instances that show disharmony in church leaders, and the building of fiefdoms, and the waiting for the other person to die, basically, who you disagreed with, so that you could then get your way, which very much relates to what recently happened, where President Hinckley was very pro-Mormon, and I'm a Mormon, and stories of Mormons, and Mormon.org, and Mormon, and then he dies, and then Elder Nelson, who had long kind of not been in support of that, becomes president. All of a sudden it's, hey, saying Mormon is a victory for Satan, and we shouldn't do it at all, and now obedient Mormons are just pushing that down the memory hole. So similarly, in David O. McKay's time, as a result of this book, you see examples when church leaders who disagreed ultimately got their way when their elderly adversary passed on. And so you could say, as a counter argument, well, that's God's order, right? That he's able to call those people home at any time, whether young or old, and so whatever happens is his will, because he's the one that orders their lives, and so perhaps there's an argument there. I still find it interesting. So it's a fascinating book, just to get a peek behind the curtain and seeing some of the kind of the political machinations and inner workings of some of these circumstances. So McKay, a lot of little clips I could share, but one I found interesting was how he was handling the issue with blacks in the priesthood back in the 50s. And he changed some policies, and he was kind of pushing against this. Well, so this is from the book now. It says that he created a special committee of the 12 in 1954 to study the issue, and the committee concluded that there was no sound scriptural basis for the policy, but that the church membership was not prepared for its reversal. 1954. Personally, the author says, I knew something about the apostolic study because I heard Adam Benyon, who was a member of that committee, refer to the work in an informal talk he made, blah, 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 blah. McKay, Benyon said, had pled with the Lord without result and finally concluded the time was not yet ripe. So it's kind of interesting to learn how he was making some private decisions without telling the church membership more broadly, loosening things. Like they used to have this one-drop policy in Africa where you had to basically prove your genealogical line and that there's no black people anywhere in your line. And only with that proof could you then get the priesthood. And so in South Africa, it was a big struggle because records were not well kept and people couldn't really prove this. And so the mission president appealed to McKay. McKay went to visit, and he basically unilaterally makes the decision to remove that one-drop policy and just say, move forward if it seems right, unless you have evidence that the person has, blacks in their lineage. And so it kind of flipped it on its head, but the church membership more broadly was not told. He just kind of decided on his own. And so it's kind of interesting to see McKay privately working through some of these things. So good book, highly recommended. Okay, 3 more. This one's a more recent one. This comes from Patrick Mason. He's a religious professor at Utah State University. And little book called Restoration, God's Call to the 21st Century World. And really engaging book, ultimately talking about how restoration is an ongoing process, that we often refer to restoration as the restoration past tense. It happened, Joseph did it, now we're just on autopilot or whatever, right? But his point, and sharing examples in here, is that the restoration is an ongoing process, that we believe in truths that have yet to be revealed, that there's more work to do, that we're still evolving. And he gives examples from his perspective about what type of evolution he thinks the church is going through and needs to go through. I'll save that for you in reading the book. So again, it's called Restoration, God's Call to the 21st Century World. Here's a short little excerpt of the book under the subtitle, Baggage. 2 cardinal rules of airports. Don't grab anyone else's baggage, and don't accept items from strangers. And if you try to travel with excess baggage, it will cost you. The Restoration does not exist independently from culture, so it's inevitable and even good that the Restoration takes on many aspects of the society in which it finds itself. In fact, the only way the gospel can find its way into people's hearts is if they find it relevant to their everyday lives. One of the foundational doctrines of Christianity is the incarnation, namely that God took on flesh and by doing so entered into human life and culture. The trick, of course, is how to take on flesh without becoming fleshy, how to be in the world but not of it, how to engage culture without becoming captive to it. Preached and practiced by humans, the Restoration has not been immune to the harmful effects of cultural captivity. Choose your own metaphor: barnacles on the ship, clutter in the closet, monkeys on our back, extra weight in the backpack. In the Lord's definition, the nature of modern-day idolatry is that every man walketh in his own way and after the image of his own God, whose image is in the likeness of the world. At various points over the past 2 centuries, and often as a result of good or at least understandable intentions, the Restoration has in some respects taken on the likeness of the world by adopting certain aspects of the surrounding culture, principally American culture. Unfortunately, some of this unnecessary baggage has compromised our ability as a people to fully accomplish the Restoration's purposes. It has cost us. If we want to receive the full message that God is revealing at the top of Sinai, then we need to tear down the graven images we have forged down below in the likeness of some of the modern world's false gods. So, poke myself. Restoration, God's Call to the 21st Century. Short little book. He's got 1 or 2 others that are good, that I've enjoyed, but this one is good. So 2 more. Let's do The Infinite Atonement by Tad Callister. Good book, came out, gosh, I don't know, 10, longer than that. Wow, 23 years ago, came out in 2000. So this book, as the title suggests, is about the atonement of Jesus Christ. Kind of like Talmage's Jesus the Christ is an in-depth review of Jesus' life and ministry. This book is an in-depth review of the atonement, trying to more deeply understand it, its significance, its purpose, its meaning, its implications. So I'm going to read a portion of this book. Again, Infinite Atonement from Tad Callister. He says, at some point, the multitudinous sins of countless ages were heaped upon the Savior. But his submissiveness was much more than a cold response to the demands of justice. This was not a nameless, passionless atonement performed by some detached stoic being. Rather, it was an offering driven by infinite love. This was a personalized, not a mass atonement. Somehow, it may be that the sins of every soul were individually, as well as cumulatively, accounted for, suffered for, and redeemed for, all with a love unknown to man. Christ tasted death for every man, perhaps meaning for each individual person. One reading of Isaiah suggests that Christ may have envisioned each of us as the atoning sacrifice took its toll. Quote, when thou shalt make his soul an offering for sin, he shall see his seed. Just as the Savior blessed the little children one by one, just as the Nephites felt his wounds one by one, just as he listens to our prayers one by one, so perhaps he suffered for us one by one. President Heber Grant spoke of this individual focus. Quote, not only did Jesus come as a universal gift, he came as an individual offering with a personal message to each one of us. For each one of us, he died on Calvary, and his blood will conditionally save us, not as nations, communities, or groups, but as individuals. Similar feelings were shared by C.S. Lewis. He, Christ, has infinite attention to spare for each one of us. He does not have to deal with us in the mass. You are as much alone with him as if you were the only being he had ever created. When Christ died, he died for you individually just as much as if you had been the only man in the world. He concludes, since the Savior as a God has the capacity to simultaneously entertain multiple thoughts, perhaps it was not impossible for the mortal Jesus to contemplate each of our names and transgressions in concomitant fashion as the atonement progressed, without ever sacrificing personal attention for any of us. His suffering need never lose its personal nature. While such suffering had both macro and micro dimensions, the atonement was ultimately offered for each one of us. I thought that was powerful. I thought that was really helpful, talking about the implications of the atonement and its significance. It's something that I think we need to study more. I appreciate in that book the depth that he goes into, kind of like with Talmage's Jesus the Christ, like I said, to try and help us understand a bit more deeply what the atonement means. So that's book number 9. Number 10, I lost my page number, so I am trying to flip through and find the quote that I wanted to share. This one is Satan's War on Free Agency by Greg Wright. I read this one, I want to say like 15 years ago, something like that. And it was the first exposure that I had to an alternative definition of agency. It's one that I've now written about in my own books, in Latter-day Liberty, and Christ versus Caesar, basically arguing that Satan did not ultimately want to force people to be righteous, as some church leaders have suggested in past decades. That's actually inconsistent with other scriptures. It doesn't really make sense. And so my first exposure to this different perspective than what a lot of our church culture has devolved into came from this particular book, written, when was this one written? 2003, 20 years ago. So here's a portion of the book talking about Gadiantons, of course, this satanic manifestation of trying to destroy people's freedom and undermine their agency. And so he says in the book that the invitation to join the Gadianton collective was never more clear than when Gideonhai, the governor of the Gadianton band, wrote a letter to Laconius, the governor of the righteous, saying, "Yield yourselves up unto us and unite with us, and become acquainted with our secret works, and become our brethren, that ye may be like unto us, not our slaves, but our brethren and partners of all our substance." This kind of invitation successfully lured many thousands of Nephites and Lamanites to join the Gadiantons over the years. But it was this offer of protection from accountability that made it possible for the Gadiantons to obtain, quote, sole management of the government. Once it became well established, a multi-layered symbiotic relationship existed in their society. The Gadiantons depended upon the people's votes to keep them in office, and the people depended on the Gadiantons to keep altering the laws to make sins more legal. The more people joined the collective, the greater the protection for everyone, resulting in even greater wickedness. In the end, the Gadiantons did not have to take control of the government because the Nephites gave it to them. Like Satan, they seduced the people with fair promises from corrupt politicians who were not really interested in preserving rights or freedom. So what one generation of Nephites had bled and died to preserve, the next generation willingly gave away. They simply surrendered to the Gadiantons without a fight. Like the third of the hosts of heaven, the Nephites surrendered to seduction, actually joining in the rebellion and supporting those who sought power over them. And thus we see that the desire to escape accountability is the reason why the Nephites did build them up and support them. It's also why this doctrine was first successful among, quote, the more wicked part of the Nephite society. The righteous are not as easily deceived because they accept their accountability and understand it to be essential to their freedom. In the Nephites' golden years, they who chose good were more numerous than they who chose evil, so the wicked had a hard time getting elected. This is why it was not possible for the Gadiantons to gain political power until after they had seduced the more part of the righteous, until they had come down to believe in their works and partake of their spoils. He concludes, having flattered the wicked and seduced the righteous, the Gadiantons were assured election, because those who still embraced the principle of accountability became the minority. That, of course, has nothing to do with the world that we live in today. So that's Satan's War on Free Agency by Greg Wright. Good book, 100 and some odd, 140 pages long. Again, I cover that in some of my books in a bit of detail, but he spends more time with it since the whole book is just about that particular topic. Okay, so there's 10 books. There may be more like these. I've got a lot of things to share, so if you like it, let me know. I thought I'd just have a little fun, little lighter topic today and give you guys some homework assignments if you're not yet familiar with any of those books. They're books that have edified and inspired me that I come back to periodically. It was hard to pick 10. There's plenty more. Some of these, as I was looking through the books, I'm like, oh, I haven't read that one in like 25 years. I got to go back and read it or read through it. When I read my books, I underline and I star things in the what do you call that? The kitchen sink on the right, whatever that's called, the margin. And so a lot of times when I go back to read books, I'll just focus on the parts that I previously had identified that I liked. I don't always do that. Sometimes I wonder, like, okay, I'm at a different stage in my life, different experiences. I may gain things out of the text that I didn't before at all. Nonetheless, it's fun to go back and read some of this stuff so that the ideas stay top of mind. So hopefully you got inspiration for at least one book there that might be of interest to you. And we'll see you next week.